Welcome back to Lead Empowered TV. I am your host, Nathan Mitchell. Today I want to zoom in on something that honestly has completely reshaped how I see communication, leadership, and team performance. And it's called the Five Voices Framework. And here's the thing. I don't think most leadership problems are actually strategy problems. I think they're communication problems in disguise. Misunderstandings, unspoken assumptions, people talking past each other, or worse, people staying silent when their perspective is exactly what the team needs. The five voices gives language to something most teams feel but can't name. It helps people understand not just how they communicate, but why they communicate the way they do, and how that shows up under pressure, in conflict, and in collaboration. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee it, because suddenly the quote difficult person on your team isn't difficult. They're a voice. The quiet contributor isn't disengaged. They're processing things differently than you. The overtalker isn't trying to dominate the conversation. They're wired to bring clarity through expression. This episode isn't going to be theory heavy. I want to walk through each of the five voices in a practical way, what they sound like, what they need, where they shine, and where they tend to struggle. And more importantly, how leaders like you and me can actually use this to unlock better performance, better conversations, and healthier teams. If you lead people, influence people, or are part of a team that matters to you, this framework will give you a new lens to look through, and probably a few aha moments along the way as well. So let's dig into it, and we're going to start with the nurturer voice. If you've ever been on a team where someone just seems to know how everyone is doing, they pick up on the tension before anyone says a single word, or they quietly check in after a hard meeting, that person is likely a nurturer. This voice is tuned in relationally. They often lead with care, they notice people, and not just performance and not just outcomes, but they really notice people. And here's something important. Nurturers are often underestimated in traditional leadership environments because they're not always the loudest voice in the room. They can get mistaken for being passive or overly sensitive as a result of that. And that's something important that a lot of leaders miss. Because when a nurturer is healthy, they are one of the most stabilizing forces on any team. They're really the glue that holds the team together. And they create emotional safety. They're very good at creating psychological safety. They help people feel seen in the workplace. And in today's work environments, that's not something that's soft. It's really strategic, and it's very much needed. And here's the tension. Under stress, nurturers can internalize things way too much. They absorb emotion. They carry responsibility for how everyone else is feeling. And instead of speaking up, they sometimes retreat into silence to keep the peace. And that silence can be costly because what they're noticing is often accurate, but unspoken. And the opportunity for growth for a nurturer is really learning that care doesn't mean carrying everything alone. It means speaking truth in a way that still honors people, but doesn't abandon clarity. And for leaders working with a nurturer, don't rush them. Don't dismiss their intuition. Ask questions. Give them space. Because what they're sensing in the room is often the early signal of what will become a much bigger issue later. When the nurturer voice is heard, teams don't just function better, they feel safer. And that changes everything. So the next voice we're going to look at, and I'm going to put up this slide here to make this helpful for you as well. We're going to look at the creative voice. And actually, this is my first voice. And creatives are thinkers. They're pattern breakers. They're the person who asks, what if we looked at this situation differently? If you've ever had someone on your team who doesn't immediately respond, but later comes back with a completely original perspective that reframes the entire conversation, that person is likely a creative. They don't rush to conclusions. They sit in complexity. They explore. They imagine. And in many organizations, that gets misread as disengagement, but it's not. It's really them processing. Creatives are often ahead of the conversation, that's happening in the room. While others are debating options, they're already seeing three levels deeper into implications, the risks involved, or perhaps even alternative paths that should be considered. Their strength is really innovation. They see what others miss. They connect dots that don't look connected yet. But under pressure, creatives can definitely withdraw. They can feel misunderstood, especially in fast paced environments that reward immediate answers over thoughtful ones. And when that happens, you don't just lose their input, you lose their perspective entirely. And the learning opportunity for a creative is really learning to bring their thinking forward sooner, even if it's not fully formed yet, because their half formed ideas might be exactly what unlocks that next step that the team needs. And for leaders, don't force speed, but do invite clarity. Ask, what are you noticing that we might be missing? Or what would you explore if we had more time? Because when a creative voice is activated, teams don't just solve problems, they really redefine them. The third voice we're going to look at in today's episode is the guardian voice, and this is the stabilizer on your team, your structure builder, the one who naturally asks, what's the process? What's the plan? What are we committing to? And guardians bring order, they bring consistency, they make sure things don't fall through the cracks. And in most organizations, they're the reason things actually get done the right way. But here's where they often get misunderstood. They're not trying to slow things down. They're trying to make things sustainable. Guardians really care about quality, they care about clarity, and they care about follow through. Without guardians, teams get exciting ideas, but often no execution. Under stress, however, guardians can become rigid. When uncertainty arises, they may double down on control or resist change, not because they're resistant to growth, but because they're trying to protect the stability of the organization. And that's an important distinction for leaders to understand. And a learning opportunity for a guardian is really learning that not every variable can be controlled before action begins. Sometimes clarity is built through movement, not before it. And for leaders, don't label a guardian as resistant. Instead, involve them in the conversation and the plan early. Ask them what could break. Ask them what's missing. Because when a guardian voice is engaged, teams don't just move fast. They move with integrity and durability. The next voice we're going to look at is the connector voice. And this is definitely the energy in the room. This is the relationship builder. This is the person who brings people together and makes collaboration actually feel possible. They have large networks of relationships and can usually provide you with whatever you need or find a resource that can make it happen. And if you've ever been in a meeting where tension is rising and one person naturally lightens the room, bridges perspectives, or makes two opposing sides feel like they can actually talk, that's connector energy happening. They are natural influencers, but not through authority. They really are influencing others through relationship. They read people quickly, they adapt, they help others feel included and heard. But here's the tension. Because connectors value harmony, they can sometimes avoid hard conversations. They may soften truth to keep connection intact. And over time, that can create misalignment because what's being felt isn't always what's being communicated. The learning curve for a connector is learning that real connection includes honesty, not just keeping the peace, but strengthening the relationship through truth. And for leaders, don't assume that silence means agreement. Invite their perspective directly, give them permission to say the thing that might be uncomfortable for them to say. Because when a connector voice is fully activated, teams just don't collaborate. They actually trust each other enough to be honest. And the last voice we're going to look at in today's episode is finally the pioneer voice. And this is really the driver, your challenger, the one who naturally asks, why aren't we further along than we are? Pioneers are very vision oriented. They see the destination clearly and they feel urgency when progress doesn't match potential. They don't just want improvement, they want momentum. And in many organizations, they're the catalyst for change. But here's the double edge. Under stress, pioneers can become impatient, very direct, and sometimes overly critical of slower moving perspectives, not because they don't value people, but because they are wired for outcomes and results. Their blind spot is often pace versus relationships with people. The learning curve, learning opportunity for a pioneer is really learning that speed without alignment creates resistance and not results. And for leaders who are working with them, don't dilute their vision, but translate it, ground it, connect it to steps that others can actually follow. Because when a pioneer voice is healthy and integrated, teams don't just dream, they execute at a higher level than they ever thought possible. When you step back and look at the five voices together, what you really see isn't just a communication tool. It's really a culture shaping framework, because most teams don't struggle from a lack of talent or effort. They struggle because voices get distorted and misunderstood. People overuse strengths, they stay silent when they should speak up, or they get misunderstood when they're actually bringing something valuable. And the five voices framework changes that. It gives language to what people naturally experience but rarely articulate. It helps a team realize that not everyone thinks, processes, or communicates the same way. And that difference isn't a problem to fix. It's actually the source of better decisions, stronger relationships, and healthier execution. When a team learns to nurture a voice, they stop overlooking emotional intelligence and start building real psychological safety at work. People feel seen and not just managed. When they understand the creative voice, they stop rushing to conclusions and start making space for better thinking. Suddenly, quiet reflection isn't disengagement, it's incitement into progress. When the guardian voice is activated, teams gain structure without being rigid. Plans stop being optional and start becoming dependable. When the connector voice is engaged, trust stops being assumed and starts being intentionally built. Communication gets more honest without losing relational strength. And when the pioneer voice is healthy, teams stop circling ideas and start moving with clarity and momentum. But the real shift happens when all five voices are working together, not competing with one another, not dominating each other, and not disappearing. That's when a team moves from good intentions to real alignment, because empowered teams are the ones where everyone thinks the same. Because empowered teams are not the ones where everyone thinks the same. They're the ones where everyone's voice is heard, where it's understood and valued, even when it's different. And that's what changes everything. Not louder voices, but clearer ones. Not more communication, but better communication. Not just teamwork, but true collaboration with trust as the foundation. And that's what the five voices creates. It really creates a culture where people don't just work together, they actually bring out the best in each other. One of the most important things that leaders need to understand about the five voices is this: every voice matters, even when it's quiet. In fact, some of the biggest dysfunctions in workplace culture don't happen because people are speaking too loudly. They happen because the right voices stop speaking altogether. And the dangerous part is it usually happens gradually. People feel dismissed one too many times, they're interrupted one too many times, misunderstood one too many times. So eventually they stop contributing at the level that they once did. So for this next section of today's episode, I want to talk about what happens when each voice goes silent. And we'll start with the nurturer voice again. At first, most teams don't notice. The work still gets done, meetings still happen, deadlines still move forward. But underneath the surface, something starts changing relationally. The emotional pulse of the team weakens. People stop feeling seen. Frustration goes unaddressed. Burnout increases. It increases quietly because no one is paying attention to the human side of the culture anymore. And nurturers are often the first to notice when morale is slipping or when someone is struggling emotionally before their performance reflects it. So when they stop speaking up, teams lose empathy, awareness, and emotional safety. And eventually, people may still work together, but they no longer feel connected to each other. When the creative voice goes silent, this one is really costly because when creatives stop contributing, innovation slows down almost immediately. Teams start recycling the same ideas, solving symptoms instead of root problems. They make quick decisions without deeper reflection. And creatives are often the ones asking the uncomfortable but necessary questions. What are we missing? Is there another way to approach this? Are we solving the right problem? But if they constantly feel rushed, dismissed, or overlooked, they stop offering those insights. And what's left is a culture that becomes reactive instead of thoughtful. And the team may stay busy, but it slowly loses originality, adaptability, and a deeper perspective. So we're going to look at the guardian voice now and what happens when the guardian voice goes silent. This is when execution begins to weaken. Details get missed, processes become inconsistent, accountability starts to slip. And guardians are really the stabilizers of healthy teams. They think about sustainability, structure, and follow through. They're usually the ones asking, do we actually have a plan? Who owns this? What happens if this fails? But when guardians feel ignored or steamrolled by constant urgency or change, they may disengage instead of push back. And once that happens, organizations often drift into chaos without realizing it, because vision without structure eventually creates exhaustion. Without the guardian voice, teams may move fast, but they stop moving wisely. So what about the connector voice? When the connector voice goes silent, the atmosphere can really change quickly. Communication can become transactional, departments isolated, and trust can even start to erode beneath the surface. Connectors naturally bring people together. They create energy, they collaborate, and they create relational momentum within a team. They're often the social glue that keeps communication flowing. But when connectors feel unheard, excluded, or emotionally disconnected, they may stop engaging relationally. And when that happens, misunderstandings can multiply very fast. People stop checking in with each other, collaboration becomes harder, assumptions increase, and the team may still be functioning operationally, but relationally it begins to fragment. And lastly, we will look at the pioneer voice. So what happens when the pioneer voice goes silent? And this often surprises people, because when pioneers go silent, teams don't necessarily collapse, they just stall. Momentum fades, urgency disappears, slowly replaces growth. And pioneers are naturally wired to challenge the status quo. They push teams toward possibility, action, and forward movement. They often ask, what's next? Why are we settling? How do we improve this? But when they feel constantly resisted, slowed down, or criticized for their level of intensity, some pioneers eventually will stop pushing. And when they do, organizations often become passive, not unhealthy overnight, just comfortable. And comfortable cultures rarely stay healthy for long. And here's the big lesson in all of this. Silence is really data. When a voice consistently withdraws, leaders should pay attention not just to the person, but to the environment that caused the withdrawal. Because empowered cultures are not built by forcing people to speak louder. They're built by creating environments where every voice feels valued enough to contribute consistently. And when all five voices are engaged, heard, and working together, teams become healthier, smarter, more aligned, and far more effective than any one voice could accomplish on their own. One of the most important things leaders need to understand about the five voices is this: every voice matters, even when it's quiet. In fact, some of the biggest dysfunctions in the workplace culture don't happen because people are speaking too loudly. They happen because the right voices stop speaking altogether. And the dangerous part is it usually happens gradually. People feel dismissed one too many times, interrupted one too many times, misunderstood one too many times. So eventually they stop contributing at the level they once did. So as we wrap up this episode of Lead Empowered TV, here's the simplest way to hold on to all of this. Every team already has the five voices in the room. The difference is whether they're being heard clearly or whether they're being filtered, suppressed, or misunderstood. And when voices get misunderstood, teams don't usually fall apart loudly. They begin to drift. Misalignment builds slowly. Good people disengage quietly. Decisions take longer than they should, and momentum starts to feel harder than it really needs to be. But when leaders learn to recognize and draw out these voices, something shifts fast. People stop second guessing whether they belong in the conversation. And that's challenging. They start contributing earlier, they start listening better, and they start trusting that difference isn't a liability, it's actually the advantage. That's really the heart of the 5 voices. We're not labeling people, we're not putting them in boxes, but we're creating awareness strong enough where people can show up more fully, communicate more clearly, and collaborate with less friction. Because empowered teams aren't built by getting everyone to think the same way. They're built by making room for every voice that's already there and helping those voices work together instead of working against each other. If you've taken anything from this episode, take this. The quality of your leadership is directly tied to the quality of listening that you create. And when you get that right, everything else gets easier. Performance gets easier, culture improves, trust, and results. I want to thank you today for spending this time with me on another solo edition of Lead Empowered TV. If you would like to experience the 5 voices for yourself, simply scan the QR code at the bottom of this recording. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Take care.